Hello, everyone. This is James Song here. Welcome back to the TOEFL Show. This is episode 46 of the TOEFL Show, and I have another great episode ready right now. I have a complete full TOEFL listening test to give you today. So this video consists of 5 full TOEFL listening passages, 2 conversation passages, and 3 lecture passages with 28 questions in it. So it's going to be exactly like TOEFL listening part of the actual TOEFL test by ETS. You need a pen and some paper to take down notes, and you must be ready to solve some listening questions. Are you ready? I am. Let's start this TOEFL listening test right now.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a library employee.
Excuse me, I received a letter that I'm supposed to return a book that I checked out back in September. It's called Modern Social Problems. But I'm writing my senior thesis, so I thought I was allowed to keep the book for the whole academic year.
So you signed up for extended borrowing privileges?
Yeah.
And we're still asking you to bring the book back?
Uh-huh. Do I really have to?
Well, let me check the computer. The title was Modern Social Problems?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It's been recalled. You can keep it all year as long as no one else requests it. But someone else has. It looks like one of the professors in the sociology department. So you have to bring it back. You can check it out again when it's returned in a couple of weeks.
Well, what if the person renews it, and I really need it right now?
All of it? Or is there a certain section or chapter you're working with?
Well, there's one chapter in particular I'm working with, but why?
Well, we normally don't do this, but because of the circumstances, we can photocopy up to one chapter of the book for you. Why don't you do that for the one you're working with right now? And by the time you need the rest of the book, maybe it'll have been returned.
Oh, that would be great.
Do you have it with you?
No, it's in my dorm room. These are books I want to check out today. Is it okay if I bring that by in a couple days?
Actually, the due date is tomorrow. After that, there will be a $2 per day fine. But you need to return it today if you want to check out any books today. That's our policy.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, not a lot of people realize that. In fact, every semester we get a few students who have had their borrowing privileges suspended completely because they haven't returned books. They're allowed to use books only in the library. They're not allowed to check anything out because of unreturned books.
That's not good. I guess I should head back down to the dorm right now.
But before you go, what you should do is fill out a form requesting the book back in 2 weeks. Then the person who requested it won't be able to renew it, and you'll get it back quickly.
I'll do that right now.
Why does the man go to talk to the woman? What will the man probably do today? What is the woman trying to explain when she mentions students who have lost their borrowing privileges? How does the man probably feel at the end of the conversation? Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
So you signed up for extended borrowing privileges?
Yeah.
And we're still asking you to bring the book back?
Why does the woman say this?
And we're still asking you to bring the book back?
Listen to part of a lecture in a linguistics class.
Okay, the conventions or assumptions that govern conversation. These may vary from one culture to another, but basically, for people to communicate, they have to follow certain rules. Like, if I'm talking with you and I start saying things that are not true, if you can't tell when I'm lying and when I'm telling the truth, well, we're not going to have a very satisfactory conversation, are we? Why? Because it violates one of the Gricean maxims. That's a set of rules, or maxims, a philosopher named H.P. Grice came up with in the 1970s. One of these Gricean maxims is, well, I've already given you a hint.
Oh, you just can't go around telling lies.
Right, or as Grice put it, do not say what you believe to be false. That's one of Grice's maxims of quality, as he called it. So that's pretty obvious. But there are others just as important. Like, suppose you were to ask me what time it was and I replied, my sister just got married. What would you think?
You're not really answering my question.
No, I'm not, am I? There's no connection at all, which feels wrong because you generally expect to find one. So one important maxim is simply be relevant. And using this so-called maxim of relevance, we can infer things as well. Or rather, the speaker can imply things and the listener can make inferences. For instance, suppose you say you'd really love to have a cup of coffee right now, and I say, there's a shop around the corner. Now, what can you infer from what I said?
Well, that the shop sells coffee, for one thing.
Right. And that I believe it's open now. Because if I weren't implying those things, my response would not be relevant. It'd have no connection with what you said before. But, according to the maxim, my response should be relevant to your statement, meaning we should assume some connection between the statement and the response. And this maxim of relevance is quite efficient to use. Even if I don't spell out all the details, you can still make some useful logical inferences. Namely, the shop is open, and it sells coffee. If we actually had to explain all these details, conversations would move along pretty slowly, wouldn't they? Okay, Then there's the maxims of manner, including things like be clear and avoid ambiguity. And another, more interesting maxim is one of the so-called maxims of quantity of information, that is. It says to give as much information as is required in the situation. So, suppose you ask me what I did yesterday, and I say, I went to the art museum. You would likely infer that I saw some works of art. Suppose, though, that I did not go inside the museum. I just walked up to it, then left. Then I violated the quantity maxim by not giving enough information. So you can see how important implications are to our ability to carry on a conversation. But there are times when people will violate these maxims on purpose. Let's say a boss is asked to write a letter of recommendation for a former employee seeking an engineering job. The letter he writes is quite brief, something like, Mr. X is polite and always dresses neatly. So what does this really mean?
Oh, I see. By not mentioning any important qualities related to the job, the boss is, implying that this is the best that can be said about Mr. X, that he's really not qualified.
Exactly. It's a written letter, not a conversation, but the principle's the same. The boss is conveying a negative impression of Mr. X without actually saying anything negative about him. So, by violating the maxims, it can be a way to be subtle or polite, or to convey humor through sarcasm or irony. Sometimes, though, people will violate maxims for another purpose, to deceive. Now, can you imagine who might do such a thing?
Some politicians?
Or advertisers.
Right. Anyone who may see an advantage in implying certain things that are untrue without explicitly saying something untrue. They think, hey, don't blame us if our audience happens to draw inferences that are simply not true. So, next time you see an advertisement saying some product could be up to 20% more effective, think of these maxims of quantity and relevance and ask yourself what inferences you're being led to draw. Think, more effective than what exactly? And why did they use those little phrases, could be and up to? These claims give us a lot less information than they seem to.
What is the main topic of the lecture? According to the professor, what helps speakers keep conversations from proceeding too slowly? For each of the following, indicate whether or not it reflects one of the Gricean maxims that the professor mentions. Why does the professor describe a letter of recommendation? What does the professor imply about advertisers? What type of maxim does the professor illustrate with this example?
For instance, suppose you say you'd really love to have a cup of coffee right now, and I say, there's a shop around the corner.
Listen to part of a lecture in an environmental science class.
I'd like to take you back about 11,000 years ago when Earth entered the latest interglacial period. Interglacial periods are typically periods of time between ice ages, when the climate warms and the glacial ice retreats for a time before things cool off again and another ice age begins. And for over the past several million years, Earth's sort of default climate has actually been ice age. But we have experienced periodic regular thaws, and the last one, the one we're in now, started about 11,000 years ago. Now, the typical pattern for an interglacial period, and we've studied several, is that the concentration of carbon dioxide and methane gas actually reaches its peak. That is, there's the most carbon dioxide and methane gas, greenhouse gases, in the atmosphere just after the beginning of the interglacial period. And then, for reasons which are not entirely clear, the concentration of greenhouse gases gradually goes down. Now, the climate continues to warm for a while because there is a lag effect. But gradually, as the concentration of greenhouse gases goes down, Earth starts to cool again, and eventually you slip back into an ice age. However, for the latest interglacial period, the one we're in now, this pattern did not hold. That is, the concentration of carbon dioxide and methane dipped a little bit after peaking at the beginning, near the beginning of the interglacial period, but then it began to rise again. What was different about this interglacial period than the other ones? Well, one of the big differences is human activity. People began to raise crops and animals for food instead of hunting for them. This is the agricultural revolution, and it began to happen in the earliest stages about 11,000 years ago. Now, scientists have tended to regard the agricultural revolution as a beneficiary of the fortuitous shift in climate. However, some new theorists of climate have proposed that perhaps humanity was having an effect on the climate as far back as the beginnings of the agricultural revolution. when you grow crops and pasture your animals, one of the things you do is you cut down the forests. If you cut down the forests, when you burn the trees for fuel and don't replace them with other trees, or when you just leave them to rot and don't allow other trees to grow, you end up with a lot more carbon in the form of carbon dioxide getting into the atmosphere. Another gas associated with the spread of agriculture is methane. Methane forms in large concentrations above wetlands. And as it turns out, the cultivation of certain grains creates vast areas of artificial wetlands and probably drastically increases the amount of methane getting into the atmosphere over and above what would be there. So agriculture, the spread of agriculture, we're talking over thousands of years. But this could very well have had a profound effect on the composition of Earth's atmosphere. It's kind of ironic to think that absent that effect, it may be that we would be heading into an ice age again. In fact, back in the 1970s, a lot of theorists were predicting that, the climate would start to cool and we'd slowly enter into a new ice age. And then they were puzzled as to why it didn't seem to be happening. Now, what are the implications for the future? Well, it's a little tricky. I mean, you could say, well, here's an example of human activity, the agricultural revolution, which actually was beneficial. We altered the climate for the better, perhaps by preventing an ice age. But then industrialization, of course, has drastically increased the amount of carbon dioxide that humans are putting into the atmosphere. The burning of fossil fuels tends to put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. So we're entering into uncharted territory now in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide, the concentrations of carbon dioxide that are now being put into the atmosphere as a result of industrialization and the use of fossil fuels.
What is the lecture mainly about? What does the professor imply about Earth's climate over the last several million years? According to the professor, what factor is extending the duration of the current interglacial period? According to the professor, what activities associated with the beginnings of agriculture may have slowed or prevented the onset of a predicted ice age? What is the professor's attitude toward industrialization? What does the professor imply when he says this?
In fact, back in the 1970s, a lot of theorists were predicting that, the climate would start to cool and we'd slowly enter into a new ice age. And then they were puzzled as to why it didn't seem to be happening.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Professor Jennings, I hope I'm not interrupting, but you wanted to see me?
Oh, hello, Suzanne. Yes, come right in. How are you doing?
All right.
Well, good. The reason I wanted to talk to you was that while you were presenting your linguistics project in class the other day, I was thinking you're a perfect candidate for the Dean's Undergraduate Research Fund.
Professor, I'm not really sure what the, Dean's...
Undergraduate Research Fund is? It is a mouthful, I suppose. Okay, here's the thing. Every year, the school has a pool of money to fund a number of research projects of undergraduate students because, as you can imagine, in-depth research often requires monetary support.
I would like to expand on my research.
Good. First, a panel of professors reviews the applications for the grant, and then they decide on which research projects should be funded. The allotted money can be used for travel expenses, to attend a conference, for example, or for things like supplies, research equipment, resources that are necessary to conduct the research.
I see.
Right. And I think you should apply for this grant. Your project is definitely eligible, and you could expand it if you had the necessary resources. So, does it sound like something you'd be interested in?
Oh, yeah, it sounds great. I thought the topic I worked on was really interesting, and it's certainly relevant to my linguistics major. I assume it would also look good when I try to get into graduate school. But how do I apply for the grant?
It's pretty straightforward. A brief description of your proposed project and an estimated budget, how much you'd need to spend and what you intend to spend it on. Also, a glowing letter of recommendation from a linguistics professor wouldn't hurt, which I'd be more than happy to write up for you.
Okay, cool. I'm pretty clear on how to carry out my project, but I'm not sure where I can find more information on the subject.
Well, I've already thought of that. There's this private library at a university in Boston. By the way, because I graduated from that school, I can get you access to it, no problem. You see, the library houses lots of unpublished documents that are relevant to your topic.
So I could put that in the application for the grant, that I plan on using material from that library for my research, and figure a trip to Boston into my budget?
Exactly. I really think, judging from your work in class and the relevance and clarity of this project, you'd really have a good chance of getting the funding.
Okay, I'll definitely apply then.
Well, the sooner the better. It's due in a few weeks. Good luck, and I'll get that letter written up right away.
Why does the professor want to talk to the student? According to the professor, what information should be included in the student's application? Why does the professor mention a university in Boston? What does the professor say he will do for the student? Listen again to part of the conversation, then answer the question.
Well, I was thinking, you're a perfect candidate for the Dean's Undergraduate Research Fund.
Professor, I'm not really sure what the, Dean's...
Undergraduate Research Fund is? It is a mouthful, I suppose.
Why does the professor say this?
It is a mouthful, I suppose.
Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
All right, so now we've talked about folk legends and seen that one of their key features is there's usually some real history behind them. They're often about real people, so you can identify with the characters, and that's what engages us in them. The particular stories might not be true, and some of the characters or events might be made up, but there's still a sense that the story could have been true since it's about a real person. That's a distinct contrast from the other main branch of popular storytelling, which is folk tales. Folk tales are imaginative stories that, like folk legends, they've been passed down orally from storyteller to storyteller since ancient times. But with folk tales, you don't ever really get the sense that the story might have been true. They're purely imaginative, and so quite revealing, I think anyway, about the culture and the connection between folk tales and the culture, which we'll talk about. But first, let's go over the various types of folk tale and focus specifically on Norwegian folk tales, since they illustrate the variety pretty well. There are, in general, three main types of Norwegian folk tales. One is animal stories, where animals are the main characters. They can be wild animals or domestic, and a lot of times they can talk and behave like humans, but at the same time, they retain their animal characteristics too. They tend to involve animals like bears, wolves, and foxes. The point of these stories, their internal objective, so to speak, is usually to explain some feature of the animal, how it arose. So there's one about a fox who fools a bear into going ice fishing with his tail. When the bear puts his tail into the water through a hole in the ice to try and catch a fish, the ice freezes around it, and he ends up pulling his tail off. So that's why bears to this day have such short tails. The second category of Norwegian folktale is the supernatural. Stories about giants and dragons and trolls, and humans with supernatural powers or gifts, like invisibility cloaks, or where people are turned into animals and back again into a person. Those are called transformation stories. There's a well-known Norwegian supernatural folktale, a transformation story called East of the Sun and West of the Moon, which we'll read. It involves a prince who's a white bear by night and a human by day, and he lives in a castle that's east of the sun and west of the moon, which the heroine in the story has to try to find. Besides being a good example of a transformation story, this one also has a lot of the common things that tend to show up in folk tales. You'll find the standard opening, Once Upon a Time, and it has stock characters like a prince and a poor but beautiful peasant girl. She's the heroine I mentioned. And it has a very conventional form, so no more than 2 characters are involved in any one scene. And it has a happy ending. And the story is presented as though, well, even though a lot of the actions that occur are pretty fantastic, so you'd never think of it as realistic, the characters still act like they resemble real people. They're not real, or even based on historical figures, but you might have a supernatural story involving a king, and he'd act like you'd expect a Norwegian king to act. Okay, the third main kind of folktale is the comical story. We'll say more later about these, but for now, just be aware of the category and that they can contain supernatural aspects, but they're usually more playful and amusing overall than supernatural stories. Now, as I said, traditionally folktales were just passed down orally. Each generation of storytellers had their own style of telling a story. But in Norway, before the 19th century, folktales were just for kids. They weren't seen as worthy of analysis or academic attention. But this changed when the Romantic movement spread throughout Europe in the mid-19th century. The Romantics looked at folktales as sort of a reflection of the soul of the people, so there was something distinctly Norwegian in folktales from Norway. And there was renewed pride in the literature and art forms of individual countries. As a result, the first collection of Norwegian folktales was published in 1852, and there have been many new editions published since then. For the people of Norway, these stories are now an important part of what it means to be Norwegian.
What is the lecture mainly about? What does the professor find appealing about folk legends? How is the story of the bear and the fox characteristic of Norwegian animal stories? Why does the professor mention a folk tale called East of the Sun and West of the Moon? What does the professor say about the characters in Norwegian folk tales? What does the professor imply happened as a result of the Romantic movement spreading to Norway?